This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 313 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's about train travel in Australia. I would like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation where I'm recording this podcast, but also to the Indigenous people of the many beautiful parts of Australia where the train journeys that I'm going to describe in this episode took me or my friends. So during this episode on train travel in Australia, you will hear about the train from Melbourne to Sydney, which I took with Susanne Etti. You will also hear from Justin Watson about his Canberra to Sydney train experience. And lastly, my own train journey from Perth to Bunbury here in Western Australia. And lots of our thoughts about the benefits of train travel along the way. So, first up, I relatively recently, in October this year, took the train from Melbourne to Sydney with my friend Dr Susanne Etti. So, Susanne is Intrepid Travel's Global Environmental Impact Manager, and she was one of my panel members for the South by Southwest conference in Sydney, but Susanne lives in Melbourne. And before we, as we got accepted for the panel and we were chatting about it, Susanne suggested this seemingly crazy but actually wonderful idea. She had made the commute from Melbourne to Sydney for work by train previously and suggested that perhaps I could fly just only as far as Melbourne, so a shorter flight, and then we could go up to Sydney by train together. And I said, of course, yes, what a great adventure. And we did this and recorded some updates along the route.
So we're 3 hours into our journey. So we're actually here on a train from Melbourne to Sydney. It sounds a bit, probably for some of the listeners, a bit crazy. Why would you do that? But the reason is I love really slow travel, and I managed to convince Amanda to join me today on this train in the business class on the train from Melbourne to Sydney.
It is lovely, actually. So, yes, we are about 3 and a bit hours in, nearly a third of the way there. Now, I spent much of the last 2 weeks on Japanese trains, so I have quite a comparison. But, we have lots of space, and it's very comfy, and we even have various facilities on board.
Yep, we
Tell
do.
Me a bit about
So there is a buffet, so you do get lunch there, but also snacks and drinks, etc. I do think you remember to refill also your water bottle, so we both brought our water bottles, so that's really good to do. Yeah, and as Amanda said, plenty of space to sit on, to do a bit of work too, but there is a bit of a limitation. Amanda, do you want to speak to that one?
Yes, so yes, I was given the good tip by Susanne to charge everything highly before I arrived, because there are no, unlike in a Japanese Shinkansen, I cannot plug in my phone or anything else to recharge. So I can only work for as long as my batteries survive. But that's maybe a good thing. And also, we've been in for 3 hours and we haven't done any work yet.
No, we have just caught up and chatted. And the other thing is probably also to let you know, there's no Wi-Fi on the train. So it is very much, it depends on the reception on your phone. But obviously we're in countryside and it's quite regional most of the time. So we're seeing a lot of, trees, indigenous trees and eucalyptus. Also a lot of sheep along the way, and grassland.
It's actually very lovely so far. So, I will report back in later, but so far so good. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to travel with you.
It is a pleasure. And so far, your idea has been a good one. So ask me again in 6 or 7 hours. Good. So, since I last checked in, what have we done and what have we seen?
Oh, what have we done? We had lunch. So there's a really good buffet, actually. So it's really impressive. They're stating very clearly where things are coming from. What was really neat, just me as a geek of recycling, that everything comes in a little, cardboard tray. And it's really encouraged to reuse the cardboard tray if you want anything from the bar. So I think that's a really nice touch. And also the food option, lunch option do cater for the vegetarians, which I think was a really good plus point. And what did it taste like?
It tasted great, actually. So I was very impressed. I had like a lentil bolognese kind of affair, very, very tasty. And all of the food options looked really cool. And it was a very organised system of you kind of ordered it before and then they said, lunch is ready and come on down. And we haven't gone down for afternoon tea, but they did announce that afternoon tea was ready as well, which is very civilised. So, yeah. And so we have just passed Yass a while back. And what else have we been seeing out the window?
The exciting part, we have seen a lot of wind farms. So we have passed a few, but we're getting to an area where probably is around 20, I would say. And yeah, it's definitely a bit windy because we're seeing the wind moving, which is fantastic. We're just pondering over where the energy is actually going and which homes are being powered, but it must be actually quite a bit of energy being produced here.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's no homes here. Like, we're in the middle of nowhere. Although it's beautiful hilly country, this sort of second third of the trip. So, yeah. Excellent. All right. And it's a beautiful sunny day, but very comfy on the train.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, as I understand, it's rolling hills. The train track is actually quite curvy at some times, so it's not a very straight line, but we're just enjoying sitting back in the seat. It's a day being offline, slow travel. Okay, it's not a high-speed train, but it's just really lovely seeing the countryside go past and just absorbing this wide Australian space and countryside.
Very well said. That's exactly how I feel.
So as you can hear, Susanna and I had a fabulous day taking the train from Melbourne to Sydney. And I also posted some pictures in the group, in the Facebook Thoughtful Travellers group at the time, and asked if anyone had any questions. And there were tons of questions. So I am going to try to answer them all. I have bundled some questions together, so hopefully everyone has an answer. But first of all, there are a lot of questions about the time, the cost and the environmental differences. So this is kind of a bunch of questions from Chelsea, Sandra, Sharon, Anna and Celeste. So the first thing was, how long does it take and what's the difference in time between taking the train and flying between Melbourne and Sydney? So this was a 12 and a bit hour train trip. And the usual flight time between Melbourne and Sydney would be about an hour and a half. So obviously a 12 plus hour train trip sounds like it's a lot longer. But I also would make sure, you do need to factor in travel time to the airport, checking in, ahead of time, going through security, travelling from the airports to the cities because they're not so central. While the train, it goes from Southern Cross Station in the heart of Melbourne and arrives right into Central Station in Sydney. So realistically, that 1.5 hour flight would take you, 4 or 5 hours at least. So it's about half the time of the train trip. It's still obviously a lot quicker. It is a problem in Australia that our rail, in those long distance rail, it's not fast. So it is, I did a bit of a comparison having recently, spent time on Japanese trains, which is a very unfair comparison. But anyway, if we could have high-speed rail, it would be different. So it is a bit under, I think, 900 kilometres to drive or train between Melbourne and Sydney. So, yeah, 12 hours is pretty slow. I checked a sort of a similar itinerary in Japan. It's basically like from one end of Japan to the other. Well, not exactly, but a long way from, the bottom of the main line onto the top. So Fukuoka to Sendai, if you want to look on a map, that's over 1,000 kilometres. So a bit longer than Melbourne to Sydney. But the train would take you about 6.5 to 7 hours. And that's including 1 or 2 changes. So really it's twice as fast. And if we could get a train that was twice as fast between Melbourne and Sydney, then it would be really comparable with taking a flight. So obviously you don't always have 12 hours to spend on a train if you are travelling on this route. So it's a problem at the moment. Now, in terms of the cost, we paid $130 to be in first class. It's $94 in the regular class. I'm not 100% sure if it's really worth it, but there was a bit more space and less competition for food where at the buffet where it was served. It was all from the same place, but if you came from the first class cabin, the queue was much shorter. And so that was like my main advantage. So flights, so I guess comparable. They can get down to kind of half that, like $60 one way with like the no frills airlines, or flights might be about the same as the train, or sometimes considerably more depending on how far in advance you book or if there's a sale on. So yeah, cost is not a massive, well, I don't think it's a massive decision maker in this scenario. Yeah, interestingly, in the in the Facebook group, Anna, my favourite Italian living in Norway listener, she mentioned that there's huge cost differences in the trains in Europe. So she said, for example, in Italy, it's much cheaper than in Norway to take the train, and that in Norway, many people would choose the car instead of the train. So cost can make a difference. Now, the final part of this is about the environmental difference. And of course, this is the big reason that we went by train. Susanne is, of course, a climate scientist. So this was, our driving force for taking the train and testing it out. I calculated using a couple of sites that Susanne had recommended, actually, and I'll put these in the show notes too. I calculated the environmental impact of a flight from Melbourne to Sydney at 187 kilograms of carbon, and by train around 44 kilograms, or about a quarter, I suppose, although some estimates, if you look in different sites, they compare train travel even more favourably. But as Chelsea, one of our listeners, had mentioned in her question, you can get really multiple diverse answers when you're trying to calculate carbon emissions. Depends on the site you use. And part of this is because all of them have to make a lot of assumptions. So if you're doing a per passenger rate on a flight or a train, it depends a lot on how many passengers that route has or that day, etc. So it's very hard to get a really, a definite kind of emissions amount. But I think the important part is to be aware of the comparative figures and recognise that some decisions you can make will definitely reduce emissions significantly. So train over plane is definitely one of those, really significantly less emissions. I also would add here, I don't tick the boxes on airlines to cancel out emissions. I prefer to make an annual calculation and donate kind of an appropriate amount to an organisation of my choice, where I feel more confident that I know where those dollars are going and that they'll have a real impact. Now, I also had lots of questions about the experience. So, for example, Louise asked about the Wi-Fi and did the tables and, could we work? So as we mentioned in our chat, no Wi-Fi, no charging points, but because I knew this in advance, I had everything charged up, ready to do a bunch of work, and each seat had a great fold-out table, so it would be really easy to sit and do work. It was really comfy, lots of space. However, in reality, Susanne and I found that we talked the entire way from Melbourne to Sydney, so we did not, neither of us got a scrap of work done, I'm afraid. But yes, Lou, it would be easy to work if you were able to, if it was, yeah. But if you have a good travel companion, then no. Actually, Justin also told me that there are new trains on the way in New South Wales which will have Wi-Fi and charging, so that's definitely an improvement. Now, Margaret noted that the food looked like it wouldn't win any presentation awards, and this is true, but it was delicious, and they really did have a bunch of really sensible, great options. So yes, it's no Shinkansen bento box, but absolutely adequate, served with many smiles. The staff on the trains were so lovely. And it was really tasty. So happy with that. Joan asked if we moved around much. Did we get bored? Did the seats recline? So I don't think the seats reclined. Susanna, please correct me if I'm wrong. But it was super comfortable. Both of us went for a few short walks, fill up our water bottles or get snacks or lunch, and to get a wine near the end of the trip to celebrate. And what I did notice as I moved around, it was definitely nowhere near as smooth a ride as the Japanese trains, but a bit bumpy, but it was fine. The scenery was changing constantly. I'll add some photos in the show notes. Definitely never bored. It was just beautiful to be looking out the window. And I love train travel anyway. So that's definitely, even if I hadn't had Susanna to chat to, I'm sure I would have been well entertained between the scenery and either, work or a good book. The time really flew. 12 hours sounds long. It didn't feel long at all. And I think because you don't feel cramped or trapped the way you do on an aeroplane, so 12 hours felt really comfortable. Actually, in the comments, Joanne Carks also replied to this, and she said the train from Sydney to Broken Hill is 13 hours. So she's taken this. And she said, the movie scenes through the window kept my book firmly in my bag. Others slept, knitted, and even exercised in the aisle, and that she got off at longer stops for a quick walk along the platform. Now, if you're curious about more issues related to train travel in Australia, and especially, when can we get faster rail connections and would it be worth it? Susanna has an op-ed that was published on LinkedIn. I'll leave a link in the show notes. It's called The Track Less Travelled, which is very clever. And she mentions there that the Melbourne to Sydney route is is the fifth busiest domestic route in the world, and the economic modelling shows that the faster rail connections would be absolutely justified by financial means alone for productivity, etc., and of course also with the good environmental impact. Now, as I said, I also want to share about some other long-distance train trips, and I'll start with one that happened in the very same week when Justin took the train from Canberra to Sydney to also join us on our South by Southwest panel. In fact, all of my panel members use public transport. Obviously, the third one, Catherine, lives in Sydney, but we took the bus in from her place into South by Southwest. So we were all walking the talk. I was proud of my gang there. So I chatted with Justin about his experience on the train from Canberra to Sydney.
The train from Canberra to Sydney is actually the slowest way from Canberra to Sydney. If you driving is about 3 hours, although admittedly you've got to get car parks at each end and in Sydney and stuff like that, so you might not get close. The bus is also around that 3 hour mark, and the train is about 4 hours, and it does depend on the stops. So the train only does stop from Canberra to Sydney. There's a couple of major stops, and then all the other stops are only if there are passengers getting on and off.
Oh, like on demand, yeah, okay.
Yes, it's on demand. And the service from Canberra to Sydney is now about the same price as a bus, so it's actually become quite popular because I'm probably the sort of person that would catch a train anyway, even if it's at an inconvenient schedule rather than catch a bus. So
it's much more comfy usually, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's like 3 a day normally, so now it's very popular.
About how much does it cost then?
Second class is about $50 roughly for an adult. And
one way?
One way, and first class was about $70. I don't think there's much difference between first class and second class on these trains, but it's meant to be extra legroom. And there's obviously no power or Wi-Fi at the moment, but I have looked into this as a train person, and they are getting new carriages, new trains next year. I will probably be one of the first people to go try that out when it happens. And the food services, I think, are very similar to the Sydney-Melbourne route. There's one hot meal, very much like a plain meal in that regard. But I guess it doesn't try to be as pretentious or as glamorous. They don't hide the fact that this is just a meal they're going to heat up comes pre-packaged in a tray, and they're going to heat up in a oven thing on the train. And you pre-order those, and they're like $12, I think, so it's not too expensive, the hot meals. Plus they have all the usual Australian fare like pies and sausage rolls and cakes and drinks and tea, coffee. I think comfort-wise it's the most comfortable way, because economy plane seats and bus seats are awful.
And does it leave, I guess it leaves very centrally within Canberra?
Surprisingly it's not in the city, but it's sort of south. And most people probably don't know the geography of Canberra, but there's a lake in the middle. The city is just kind of to the north of the lake, and this train station is just on the south side of the lake, nearer to the Parliament House district and everything like that. But the good thing is it's got free parking there, which is probably another reason people.
Oh, that's easy.
Yeah,
perfect.
And it's not right in the city, but it did used to go into the city years and years ago, and then a flood wiped the track out or something. So it's a historical thing. It goes along the historical route where all these towns, like 100 years ago, would have been bustling sort of country towns, but now less so. But they were certainly bigger cities before Canberra was built. So it follows along that kind of line, and then it's just a spur off that main line.
Cool. So overall rating is yes, would do again?
Well, I've done it twice this year, so I think that's probably a good thing. Yep. And I think by the time you look at your costs, like with the costs of petrol these days and the cost of parking in Sydney, especially if you're going for, like I went for 2 nights up for South by Southwest, so yeah, that was over $50 a day parking just at the hotel. So that
yes, exactly. Because if you're going to Sydney to do something centrally and you're going to be staying in the centre, then it seems to me pretty practical. You don't need a car there. Yeah. So
2 days parking would have cost me more than the train ticket, or close to the train ticket. and they don't have petrol, which is, depending on your car, could be $50 to $100 worth of petrol. 100, a full tank, probably $100 these days.
Yeah, easy. Yeah, these days. And you get the comfort of sitting on the train instead of sitting in your car, which I much prefer. So another winning train journey, I think. Finally, just to round this off, I wanted to tell you briefly about my own recent experience here in Western Australia. I had to go south to run workshops for the Tourism Council in Yallingup near Margaret River. And I went early to stay with my friend Pam near Busselton. And I knew I was able to get a lift back up to Perth with one of my colleagues. And so I took public transport down to Busselton. That involved the Australind train from Perth to Bunbury and then a bus from there. It was substantially quicker than driving. It just made 5 stops, and usually that distance would easily take a couple of hours, and it was closer to an hour and a half. And it was a whole heap more comfortable than driving, especially it's driving just down a freeway and highway. It's not very scenic. The train was much prettier. It was super relaxed. It was mostly older passengers. It was midweek, so not school holidays or anything. So I'm not sure if it differs otherwise. But yeah, lots of older passengers. I think probably because the government gives seniors a free train ride per year, so they may have been taking advantage of that. The staff was super lovely. There was still no Wi-Fi or charging points, but I'm used to that now on Australian trains. They did have a good food section, and they made some really tasty-looking toasties. I'd already eaten, but I saw my neighbour with one. And my new favourite PA announcement happened a couple of hours. Oh, no, can't have been. Must have been an hour in. And they came on to the PA, said, "The toasting machine will be turned off very shortly. Any requests for toasties need to be made now." So I kind of like that. I'm not sure if toasty, I guess it's probably an Australian word. Anyway, toasty equals toasted sandwich. Very popular snack. Anyway, unfortunately, actually, that train is now a bus for the next year or so. They're doing some track work here on the Armidale line out of Perth, which is the line that the Australind train uses. So I was actually lucky by chance to be travelling on it in its final week for a while. So it was a really pleasant journey. And I hope that those 3 trips give you some ideas of what it's like to travel by long distance train in Australia. We're not talking like long distance. Those trains like across Australia are really only for tourists these days. There's no, they're quite expensive. They're not a way to get around. But these kind of distance are plausible ways to travel, even for work. But we need some improvements, as you can tell by our conversations. But I would still encourage you to take it. It's a beautiful way to travel, and it's a way to, really just see what's there. Much more pleasant than taking the plane, and more comfy than driving too, I think. So, thank you very much for listening to episode 313 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I have got a bunch of links to share. They'll also be in the show notes. But thank you very much to Susanne Etti, basically for coming up with the entire idea of this episode and inviting me on our fabulous train trip from Melbourne to Sydney. I would encourage you to follow Susanna's posts on LinkedIn because she posts really thoughtful and useful posts about climate and environment issues in the travel space. And I'll leave a link to her op-ed on the Track Less Travelled as well. Thanks also to Justin Watson for hopping on to tell me about his Canberra to Sydney trip as well. And you can read Justin's travel blog at justins.world. I will leave a link to a couple of emissions calculators, in particular for flight emissions. Susanna recommends Atmosphere, ATMOS FAIR, which I have seen before, and it does seem to be good. So there's a couple of other links in the show notes for that. Don't forget to join either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups for Thoughtful Travellers, or both. There's different discussions happening in each. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in either Facebook or LinkedIn and you'll find us there. And if you want to see all these links and some photos from our trip from Melbourne to Sydney, you can see what it looked like out the window as we chatted, then they will be in the show notes. And for this episode, you can find them at notaballerina.com/313. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.